The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the first of 6 series of the Lunch and Learn. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard because often that's an issue and I don't want to be talking to myself for an hour. Now you'll notice if you're new to this, over on the right hand side there is a question box. Now what I'd like you to do, if you can hear me, obviously if you can't do this, I'd like you to type in the word clear. So if you could just do that, that would let me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you, Maxine. Thank you, Julene. Thank you, Chelsea. Good morning. Thank you. Okay, it sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is great. So the other thing about that is that question box is an opportunity for you to type any questions or comments that you've got to make about any of the content that I go through during the session. So in other words, what I'd like to do is I'd like to encourage you to ask questions and make comments at different times as you go through. Thanks, Catherine. Make comments as we go. So in other words, we don't leave this awkward sort of silence at the end of the session where people are sort of thinking about, well, what questions do I want to ask, if any? So ask them when you feel that you want to ask them, and that way we can make this as participatory as possible. So when you ask a question, what actually happens is that I'm the only person that sees the question, right? So no one else sees it. Obviously what I'll do is I'll read it out and I'll respond to it, but if you ask the question at the right time, I'll just stop and I'll respond to it. Okay, so that's the deal. That way we make this as interactive as possible. As you can imagine, we can't unmute everybody because if we unmute everybody, there'll be a whole lot of background noise that won't be useful for the webinar. So that's how we make this as participatory as possible. And usually people are a little bit shy to start with, but people warm up pretty quickly after a while when they realise it's not terribly threatening, just like it would be if it was a normal workshop. Now, a couple of things about the Lunch and Learn series that are important. At the end of this hour, what you will receive is a copy of the slides. So the slides that you're seeing in front of you, this is the start. The slides you see in front of you, you'll get a copy of those. And you'll also get a recording. So if you want to go back over any of the information, or perhaps you just can't make a session, because obviously we've got 6 sessions and for some reason you just can't make a session, we'd encourage you to be here, obviously. But if you can't make a session, you'll get a copy of the recording and be able to go through and review that in your own time, which is always useful. So that gives you a little bit of an idea as to how it works. Now, the other thing is, of course, you would have got an email from me which had a whole lot of links on it. So unfortunately, you can't just put your name in and email address and then you're registered for all 6 sessions. So for all intents and purposes, they're each 6 separate sessions. So you have to actually register for each session. So that's why I suggest to you to register for all the sessions up front, so it saves you a whole lot of trouble. But if you didn't do that, what I'll do is I'll send out another email to you with the slides and the presentation, and then you can register for the additional 5 sessions. Now, why is that important to do that up front? Well, there's a couple of good reasons. One is that it means that you won't miss out on any automated emails, any reminders, because obviously if you're registered, you receive those, but if you don't register, you won't receive those. That's one very good reason. The other good reason to register early for all the sessions, even if you can't attend, okay? So that's the important thing. Even if you can't attend, you register. And the reason why that's important, the other good reason for that is that you will receive the slides and recording, and also you can put those dates into your calendar, and that's always useful. So if you put them into your calendar, then that makes it a priority, and that way, because it's a priority, it means that you won't get waylaid doing other things. So there's good reason to do that, and I'd ask you to do that. So one is to participate, and two is to register for those sessions. All right, so let's get on with it. Now, we're going to look at the characteristics of high-performing teams to start with, and we're going to look at some characteristics of those during this session, and obviously there's a whole lot of other topics we'll look at as well in each of these sessions. So what I've done is I've tried to make these as practical as possible. I have actually given you homework to do at the end of each session, and the homework is very practical. And basically, you can start implementing your homework this afternoon after lunch. So it is actually very practical, no theoretical homework. It's all around doing something to help you improve your capacity to lead your team. And that's essentially what it is. Yes, Jane, good homework. That's right. So yes, you've got homework, because actually, if you think about it, nothing changes. If you sit here and you say, oh, that was very entertaining and that guy was very interesting, but really, nothing changed. Well, obviously, nothing changes unless you do something differently. So that's what the homework's about, is to get you to do things differently. All right, so there is homework, but the homework is very practical and it's not terribly onerous. All right, now what you're seeing on your screen, and this will come up on your screen shortly, there's a slight delay, there we go, coming up now. You can see that there are 6 units in the Lunch and Learn series. So basically, I'll just run through them very briefly with you, because obviously, it's important to understand what the content is. So, as I said, today we're going to look at the characteristics of high-performing teams. And in Unit 2, we'll look at the 4 stages of team development. Now, I probably recognise that some of you got very well-established teams, and probably in terms of development, it's reasonably advanced. But if you've got a new team, you've actually cycled through 4 different stages of team development. So what I want to do is cover what those 4 stages are, and then consider what you need to do as a leader in order to move the team on to the next stage. So these stages are very predictable, and you'll find that if you look closely at your team, you'll be able to identify what those stages are. Then in Unit 3, I'm going to look at some tools for leading teams, and I want to look at some ways that you can actually improve your leadership around leading teams, and I'll share with you a couple of really reputable tools and models in that regard. In Unit 4, we'll look at the roles that people play in teams, and this is based on some very reputable research that suggests that when people come together in a team, what happens is that they either consciously or subconsciously play a certain role. And so, for example, if we all landed on a desert island tomorrow and we're sitting around a campfire wondering how we'd get rescued and survive, each of us around that campfire would consider different ways of contributing to that conversation. And we'd all have different approaches, and sometimes and what I'm trying to do in Unit 4 is to give you an idea of what those particular roles might be, so that you can look for those roles in your team and in yourself as well, of course. In Unit 5, we'll look at managing team conflict and negotiation. So what I'm proposing to do there is I'll get you to complete a diagnostic. What I'll do is I'll get you to complete that before Unit 5. So Unit 5 will be a bit of a debrief on that, and let's be honest about this. There's always going to be conflict in a team, no matter how well functioning it is. Yeah, that's right, Jane. It's just like Survivor. I think you're getting the swing of how to get involved in this, so well done. So you're going to look at and this is how you like to operate in terms of conflicts, and what's your preferred conflict resolution style, and basically how can you broaden and improve your conflict resolution style to get the very best from your team. That's what Unit 5 is about. And then Unit 6 is we'll look at developing a team culture. Your team right now has a culture. Whether you realise it or not, it has a certain way of doing things, and you've either created that deliberately, or it's just happened by accident, or you've inherited it from someone else, some other team leader. So how can we do this consciously, and how can we do this in a very productive way is what we'll look at in Unit 6. So hopefully, folks, that will be an enjoyable and practical series for you. So let's get stuck into Unit 1. I think I had most of those logistics out of the way now. So look, I'm going to share with you the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. And these characteristics are characteristics that I have identified from my own observations and my own research. I'm also, at the moment, writing another book. This will be my 9th book, which is essentially about these 8 characteristics. This came from an article I wrote on LinkedIn not too long ago. It got about 30,000 hits, and it was obviously very popular, and I thought, well, there must be a book in that. But really what I was asking people to do was to identify what they perceive to be the characteristics of high-performing teams. So the model I'm going to share with you this morning is essentially what those 8 characteristics are. And then I'm going to ask you very shortly to identify some high-performing teams. Now, the best place to look, of course, is in the sporting world. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to type in, some examples of what you perceive to be high-performing teams. And we'll just probably spend a little bit of time just talking about those examples. And then, of course, for the rest of the session this morning, I'm going to talk about some tools that you can use to create high-performing teams. Now, you might be leading a high-performing team. You may not, and you may want to. So these tools will help you to, and that will, of course, be your homework, is to implement some of those tools, which aren't difficult to do and very practical. So that's where we're going over the next short session. So let's look at the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams, and let's consider what they might be. But just before I do that, I have a question for you, and I really want you to participate in this. I'd like you to type your answer in over in the question box here. So I'm asking you this question. It should be coming up on your screen just about now. There we go. What are some examples of high-performing teams in the world of sport? So I'd like you to just type in some examples of what you might perceive to be high-performing teams in the sporting world. I guess you could consider it anyway. The Croatian soccer team. Righto, thank you. I'm just going to get there. Wow, it's fantastic. With lots of participation here. The Queensland Maroons prior to this year. Yeah, Chris, I agree. I think we probably didn't do quite as well as Queenslanders, of course, didn't do quite as well as we'd like this year. The All Blacks, yeah, okay, so perhaps we've got a Kiwi there. The Australian swimming team, thanks Rachel. Collingwood, okay, so rowing and soccer teams, absolutely. I mean, when you think about rowing, that's about, it's really very much a team sport. The Australian cricket team, prior to the ball tampering scandal, thanks Julian, yeah, I agree with that. I think that tarnished the image of the Australian cricket team for a while. The Australian Paralympics team, thank you Chelsea. The Aussie cricket team, 2000 to 2010, said Stephen. The Australian netball team. Thanks, Tracy. This is great. Yeah, keep it going. The Hawks, says Agnes. Wow, there's a lot of teams here that are high performing. So if you think about those teams, it probably is pretty useful, because what you can identify then is some of the characteristics that were very prevalent. Now, obviously, what we're trying to do here is to develop. Michelle says, I don't watch sport, but I agree with all the above. Thank you. So what we're trying to do here is to create a situation where we can perhaps look for the characteristics in our own team. And it is possible to do this. You might think it might be a fruitless task, but I can assure you it is very possible to do this. All right, so that's brilliant, people. Well done, and I've enjoyed your responses there. So let's look at these 8 characteristics now, because You'll recognise these characteristics in the examples that you've given, and you will also hopefully be able to evaluate your own team based on these characteristics. All right, so here they are. They're coming up on your screen now, which is great. Let's have a look at each of these characteristics. So I'll just go through them, but looking at the model there to start with, this is the model that I put together based on the my own observations and reading and all the rest of it. One thing that you'll notice about the model, what do you notice about, now you'll notice of course there are 8 characteristics if you count them up. So I mentioned 8, but what do you notice about the 8 characteristics? Does anyone just type it on the question box? What do you actually notice about these 8 characteristics that make it interesting? Anyone want to have a go at that? Aha, well done, Sean. You get a prize. Thanks, Denise. They are all joined together. Yeah, they are all. So in other words, if one of these characteristics, here's the bad news. If one of these characteristics is missing in your team, it's likely that other characteristics will be missing in your team. Likewise, here's the good news. If one of these characteristics is present in your team, it's likely to impact on others. Diana, that's exactly right. They complement each other. So what that actually means, the good news, is that if you build one of these characteristics in your team or develop it, it is likely to be, you're likely to develop another characteristic around these 8. Now you might say, well, why isn't there 10? Why isn't there 12? Why isn't there 4? Look, these are 8 characteristics. I dare say there'd be many, many other characteristics as well, but at the end of the day, these are the 8 that we're going to concentrate on. And if you can develop a team that have some of these characteristics, you're likely to have what we might refer to as a high-performing team. All right, so yes, they're all interrelated. So let's actually have a look at some of these characteristics and consider them in the process. So if we start up the top, we'll go clockwise, starting at 12 o'clock. So seeking purpose. So a high-performing team has a very clear purpose of what they're doing. So now the test of that is if you actually go out of this broadcast and this afternoon you go around to your team members and you say, could you identify what our core purpose is? And you ask, say, 4 people or 5 people in your team, what you would be hoping, of course, once there was a bit of a stunned look, but once they responded, what you'd be hoping for is a similar sort of response, wouldn't you? I mean, you'd expect that the team members would all identify a similar purpose. Of course, if you ask 4 people and you've got 4 different answers, that would be problematic. It would suggest that perhaps the purpose isn't clear. So we need to have a clear purpose of why the team is in existence. The team is not working in a vacuum, so it needs to communicate externally. So outside the team, we call this boundary spanning. The team needs to be able to communicate with key stakeholders, and the obvious key stakeholder is your boss. Now, your boss has a huge impact on how effective your team is, because obviously if they're not going to be supporting you and your team, well then obviously that's going to create problems, but that's only one of many different stakeholders that you deal with outside the team. So a high-performing team builds alliances up and networks beyond the team. Building trust, well obviously trust is critically important in a team, and that might be an interesting little question that you might ask your team as well. How would you rate trust in our team? And you'll find that will fluctuate. Some people will have a high level of trust, others will have a low level of trust, or lower level of trust. And that will actually ebb and flow depending on what you're working on, the personalities in your team and so forth. So that's a perennial challenge for anyone who's a team leader. Then we've got shared leadership. So shared leadership is, Jane, good point. So externally is not external to the organisation, it's both. So you will have, obviously, stakeholders well, not obviously, but you're going to have stakeholders external to the team within the organisation, and you'll have stakeholders perhaps external to the organisation as well, particularly if you're a customer focused type of team. So these are people that you need in order to sustain yourself effectively as a team. Now, shared leadership means that you should be trying to share the baton of leadership with everybody in your team. Now, I'll talk a little bit, obviously, more about that later, but if you're the one who's the only one that's calling the shots in your team, and you're the only one that's, basically doing everything in your team to lead the team, then the team are probably going to be passive recipients of that. So we want actually people engaged in the team, so we need to share the leadership baton if possible. We also need to create systems in our team that work, and every single team has its own unique way of doing things, and you could do a lot worse than look at some of your systems and processes and consider how they might be done more effectively, faster, easier. Could you eliminate some processes? Now, I'm not talking about processes outside the team, I'm talking about processes within your team. So obviously you need to have good processes and procedures, efficient and effective processes, and if you have those, then obviously the team's got a better chance of operating. We also need to harness differences. Now, the rhetoric is diversity is great, and of course that's true, but the problem with diversity is that when you've got diversity in your team, and that could be cultural diversity, it could be preferential diversity, it could be age diversity, it could be experience diversity. When you have diversity in your team, it can also create tension, because obviously people don't see eye to eye necessarily initially, because other people don't see the world the way they do, for example, they don't have a different perspective. But at the end of the day, a high-performing team actually tries to harness these diversities. And so your job is, of course, to cultivate an opportunity to do that. The irony is that teams that are all similar, maybe all similar age, maybe all similar experience, doing similar jobs, it's not, maybe everyone gets on like a house on fire, but the reality is there's a lack of diversity which could impact on the team's ability to get the job done. So harnessing differences is really, really useful in a team. So I'll talk more about that, of course. And being adaptable and flexible and malleable is critically important, because the truth of the matter is the world is moving so fast, so rapidly. We're all bombarded with information from all directions every day. We're all busy, busy, busy. It never ends. The reality is we need to be adaptable, and we need to be able to do that. So a good team is actually very, very adaptable. Chelsea asked the question, does being aware of bias help with this? Yes, Chelsea, you're talking, of course, about harnessing differences, and I know you're talking about unconscious bias and making unconscious bias conscious so that you actually understand your bias or biases. And yes, that can be very, very helpful. But, just appreciating differences and being able to utilise them effectively is critically important if you're trying to be diverse and if you're trying to be adaptable, okay? So I'll talk about that obviously in more detail shortly. Now, the final one in the list that I think is critically important is a continuous learning culture in your team. That your team, or at least team members, haven't switched off and said, I've stopped, I'm too old to learn, or, you hear these cliches, I'm too old to learn, or, I'm used to doing things a certain way and I don't really want to change. Now, that's poison to a team, and really as a team leader, you've got to stop that. In fact, it's a myth. A lot of people say that age, at a certain age, your ability to learn something is hampered. Well, actually, that's not true. The latest research in neuroplasticity shows clearly that the brain continues to change in terms of, if you took a scan of your brain and you, for example, meditated for 6 weeks in a row, and I know some of you, I'm sure, do meditate, but if you did that and you took a scan before and you took a scan after, and this has been verified in research, your brain is actually a different shape after 6 weeks of meditation. And the argument is if you can do something like that, then it's likely that your brain is constantly changing throughout your lifetime. So this idea that, I'm too old to learn is a whole lot of nonsense, that it's a myth that's been perpetuated in our society that's actually incorrect and has been demonstrated to be incorrect over the last 5 years. So there's our 8. Okay, so there's our 8 characteristics, and what I'm going to do now is spend a bit of time talking about that. Yes, Jane, it is worth looking into meditation. I strongly recommend it, actually. It's one of the best things that I do in the morning, and I'm not here to talk about meditation, but seeing you ask, yes, it's great. It does work really, really well, and we could spend a whole session on that, which I won't. I'll keep going, but thank you anyway. So let's have a look at each of these. Now, what I want to do for the rest of the session is basically run through some things that you can do, some very practical things that you can do that will help you to create these eight characteristics I've just mentioned. Now, the first thing on the list is a sense of purpose. Now, one of the things that you should be doing as a team leader is setting very clear expectations for your team members. Now, you may think you're doing that, but I can assure you it's quite an elusive topic. And I want to actually suggest to you that it's a lot more difficult and challenging than you might think. So let me run through some questions that you could ask yourself and others when you're actually setting expectations for your team. So let's have a look. This slide will come up on your screen very shortly. There we are. And what I'm going to do is share with you 7 questions on managing expectations. The first key question you've got to ask yourself is this: what are your expectations as a leader? Are you crystal clear in your head about what your expectations are as a team leader? Now you might think, well, that's a bit of a dumb question. Of course I'm aware of it. Well, are you in every facet of what happens in your team? Are you crystal clear about the minimum acceptable standard of performance in a range of areas? Are you crystal clear about the values? Are you crystal clear about the tasks? That's very important, because obviously if you're not crystal clear about that, then it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to manage expectations. So that's the first key question. Once you're crystal clear about your expectations, the second question you've got to ask yourself is this: have I communicated those expectations to my team? Now, you might say, yeah, well, I did that once and nobody seemed to take any notice. Well, it's one of those things that have to be done persistently and consistently. It's one of those things that you have to keep talking about. Not only should you talk about it with your team, but you should also do it in one-on-one in the corridor with your team members. You should be talking about your expectations all the time. I should be able to walk up to any of your team members and say to them, what are the top 3 expectations that your team leader has of you? And they should be able to rattle those off without any ums and ahs. I wonder if that's going to happen. The third question you've got to ask yourself then is, do your team understand the expectations? Well, look, it's one thing for you to know what they are. It's another thing for you to have communicated them. Do they actually understand what they mean? You may understand what they mean. Well, I hope you understand what they mean, but do they understand what you mean? So that becomes critically important. Then the fourth question that comes up is, do my team members accept my expectations? So it's one thing understanding what you're on about, but it's another thing is, do they actually accept them? Do they actually accept them as realistic? Do they actually accept them as part of their workload? That becomes quite important, because obviously if somebody doesn't accept them, then it's highly unlikely they're going to meet them because they don't accept them. So that becomes an issue. Now, this question 5 is, are my team members committed to meeting those expectations? Now, we make an assumption when we communicate expectations to people that they understand them, that they accept them, and perhaps they're even committed to them. Big mistake. Some people are not, believe it or not, committed to meeting your expectations. Right? So how do we actually make sure that people commit to meeting expectations? Well, we simply ask them for their commitment. So we actually say to people, can I get your commitment to meet this expectation? Now, that's not an unreasonable question. Or you can say, this is really important, I need your commitment on this. Just ask the question, and if there's a nod, a grunt, or a yes, then you've got their commitment. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll follow through, but there's a better chance of them following through with a nod, a grunt, or a yes. And if they don't follow through, then you're in a position where you can actually say to them, look, you did commit, what went wrong? You see, so that becomes really, really important to do that at that stage. So Chelsea asks, I'll try is not a commitment. Absolutely spot on, Chelsea. Now, if people say, oh, look, I'll give it a go, or I'll try, that's code for I'm not committed, right? So let's not delude ourselves. So just, and what if they say no, says Sean? Well, if they say no, then you have a conversation about why not. So someone says, no, I'm not committed to this. Good, at least we know, so there's no misunderstanding about it, because what happens if they didn't say no and they weren't committed? Then you get really frustrated. At least if you know they're not committed, then you can ask why. What is it? And talk through with that. Maybe they think it's unrealistic. Maybe they think it's not part of their job. Maybe they think it's somebody else's job, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons why people won't commit. But if you don't discuss it, then you're not in a position to be able to do anything about it. So, Sean, just ask the question and just sit back and have a listen to what you have to say. I know a great pair of authors have written a book on conversations at work, says Chelsea. Yeah, I think I know that book. I think it's, I think I might be one of the authors. So, yeah, I do talk about expectations in the book. You're absolutely right. Number 6, do my team members know how they're performing against those expectations? Absolutely. Look, are you giving people regular, persistent feedback? I mean, if people don't know whether they're meeting your expectations because you haven't given them feedback, then that's going to be a problem, because they won't feel comfortable about where the line in the sand is. So make sure they know that they're meeting or not meeting your expectations. And the final question that becomes critically important in all of this is question number 7. And question number 7 is, am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? All right? So are you removing organisational roadblocks? Are you, paving the way by communicating with people external to the team? Are you doing what you need to do to help people to meet those expectations? Now, I'm not doing all of this here on this screen just to say, wow, just to confuse everyone. I'm simply making the point that if people aren't meeting your expectations, it's probably because one of these questions haven't been answered affirmatively. So what it means is that this gives you a checklist to say, well, what am I missing here? What's actually going wrong? And what can I do to rectify the situation? So that's how we seek purpose, which is one of the key things in the high-performing team characteristics. The second one on the list is communicating externally. Now, your job is to be, I guess you could call it sounds a bit grand, but the roving ambassador for your team. So your job is to actually create good working relationships with other members of the organisation and also with stakeholders outside the organisation. Now, one of the things you might like to do with your team, it's a very practical exercise and it's very useful, is to actually have a conversation with the team, get them together at a team meeting instead of just constantly doing the mindless reporting back. Sure, you've still got to do that, but shorten that and run a session on this and just say to people, draw a circle in the middle of the whiteboard and then just draw some spokes out. And on each, ask people, who are our key stakeholders outside this team? And you make a list of all of those stakeholders. You'll probably find that there'll be 6, 7, maybe more, but these are key stakeholders. The question is, without them, we couldn't do our job. So obviously one of those key stakeholders would be your boss. But you get the team to give you those responses, and then you say to your team, okay, let's rate each of these stakeholders on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of their influence and impact on our team. 10 is high, 1 is low. So you start going through each and rating each on a scale of 1 to 10. So you then look at your high scores. So let's say we've got an 8, a 9 and a 10 on the list. You then say to your team, what can we do to build even better working relationships with these key stakeholders? And you get your team involved in the process of communicating externally. That is probably one of the most practical, fun and enjoyable exercises you can do with your team, and it probably only will take 10 minutes, so we're not talking a huge amount of time. So that's a very practical thing that you can do to identify the key stakeholders external to your team and what you might do in order to build better working relationships up with them. So give that a shot. Now, one of the things that I strongly recommend is that you develop a culture of conversation in your team. Now, I won't go through all of this in great detail, but one of the frameworks that I use that's gaining a huge amount of popularity around the world at the moment is the 5 Conversations framework, which is what you've got in front of you. And really, you should be having conversations with your team members. So building teams up is not just about having great meetings, it's also about you building one-on-one relationships up with your team members, working relationships, of course. So we've got, climate review. So, what about if you talk to each of your team members about their job satisfaction at the current time? That goes up and down like a yo-yo, we know that. But if you ask people, well, if you had to rate your job satisfaction right now out of 10, what would you rate it? And they said a 6. And then you might say to them, well, okay, it's a 6. Why is it a 6? And you get them to tell you. And then you might say to them, do you think we could ever get it to a 7 or an 8? And they might say, oh, I don't know about that. And say, well, what would I need to do to help you get from a 6 to a 7? Good question. And they may not have a good answer for you, but at least you're engaging in a conversation with your team members. Then perhaps in month 2, you could talk about strengths and talents. So what are some of the strengths that your team have? Well, there's a high correlation, incidentally, between things that people enjoy and the strengths that they have. And if you look at what people enjoy doing, you're highly likely to be looking at things that people are probably good at. Tim, we discussed this in the public sector management program as a way to inform performance reviews. Thanks, Chelsea. That sounds like Aubrey or someone's done a job for me. So it's a continuous conversation and simply formalised at the interview. Absolutely. That's spot on, or you just get rid of the performance review if you can do that. I know some of you can't. And then you just have the 5 Conversations framework as your approach. But I mean, either way, it's useful. So it's good to hear that other people are sharing my model. So opportunities for growth are areas that you've got to work on, learning and development. Now, if you have a conversation with people about their strengths and their opportunities for growth, it's highly likely that there's going to be some learning opportunities that come out of that. Now, learning doesn't mean sending people off to a QUT course or whatever. Learning and development is really about, it could be coaching, it could be having a conversation, it could be showing people how to do things, it should be mentoring, all sorts of things, but that can be a really great conversation. And the innovation and continuous improvement is how can we do things better, faster, easier, more cost effective, whatever it is. So there's a framework. Now, if you want more information about that, let me know. But I just think that each of you need to have good dialogue with each of your team members on a regular basis if you're serious about developing your teams into perhaps high performing. Now, number 3, characteristics of trust. So, look, I know you know this is important, and you may say, well, my trust levels vary depending on who I talk to in my team, and that's probably the case. At the end of the day, this slide that will come up shortly just shows you some of the attributes of trust. Now, I don't want to go through all of those with you in great detail, but I just simply want to say to you this, that if you want to be a trusting leader, you need to be authentic, all right? So just be yourself, right? Leadership is about being more of yourself, not about being different. Now, the other thing about trust that's important is be humble, all right? Now, humility means if you make a mistake, admit it. Just say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And you go and rectify it. People know that you're a human being, but sometimes as a team leader you pretend not to be because you think that you're not supposed to be. Of course you're a human being, and so are your team. So just show a little bit of vulnerability. Be confident in your capacity to just be a human being who happens to be a manager or a team leader. Now, I'm hoping that makes sense. But if you're authentic and you're humble, you're miles ahead, and people will start to trust you. All right, so have a look in the mirror and ask yourself those questions. I think is a good starting point in terms of building trust. Having said that, though, just because you're trustworthy, of course, some people may not be terribly trustworthy in the team. That's true. You just have to accept the reality of it. But all you're trying to do is to build trust as high as you possibly can. Bear in mind, it's never going to be 100%, okay? It's never going to be 100%. That's not realistic, but you can certainly build it up to where it is, from where it is, and that's really useful. Number 4 on the list is shared leadership. So what do I mean by shared leadership? Well, I guess what I'm referring to here is, I guess Hershey and Blanchard's model of situational leadership. You should be fairly flexible about how you lead teams, and I'm certainly going to talk about this more in Unit 3, but have a think about this. This is his model. I mean, you've all seen this model, I'm sure. It's one of the best known leadership models out there, and basically it says that depending on the people that you lead, the situation that you're in, and the style you have, means that you vary your leadership accordingly. Now, as I said, I'll spend more time on this, but at the end of the day, if you look down the bottom, you'll see on the left-hand side, D4. D4 says somebody that's highly competent and highly committed, right? So if you've got a team of highly competent and highly committed individuals, then your leadership style should be very much around delegating, because you've got a good team and you've got a team that are very committed. Now, of course, if you go to the other end of the scale, if you've got a team with low competence and perhaps high commitment, right, you might start using directing and coaching. So you need to vary your style depending on the circumstances that you're in, and that's what I'm talking about, because you've got to be flexible and adaptable in your leadership style. I will obviously spend a lot more time talking about that. as we go through the program, because there are a number of things there that I can touch upon in a bit more detail. Now, the next thing is effective working procedures. Now, the reality is, if you don't have effective working procedures, now this is within your team. I know full well that there's probably ineffective working procedures that you've got to deal with that are beyond your team and perhaps beyond your control. And there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, you just have to accept it for what it is. But within your team, you should have effective working procedures. So what works for you? How often should you meet? During those meetings, what's discussed? What isn't discussed? How can you turn your meetings into discussions rather than mindless reporting? What can you do to build better working relationships with each of your team members? How do we communicate with each other? All of these questions are about working procedures. All right, these things you need to, and of course, if you can do it collaboratively with the team, it's even more effective because then they have some ownership of what those things are. James just says this is the same as creating systems, which was one of the characteristics mentioned earlier. Yes, exactly. This is about systemizing your team and how they work. Tracy asks, what does directive behaviour look like? Directive behaviour is where you basically, and I don't mean yelling and screaming, you basically be very firm and tell people what's required of them. And so you would use that directive behaviour in situations where health and safety or where procedures need to be followed to the letter and there's just no room for negotiation. That's where you'd use it. But, so you'd use it in those situations where it's black and white, there's no greys. Okay, so that gives you a bit of an idea, Tracy, as to how you might use that. So let's have a look at this little list here I've put up, which you might find useful. And what the list shows you is look, these are just questions you might like to look at yourself, look at your own team. How do you improve the quality of what you produce in your team? How do you reduce the time you deal with things? How do you reduce the costs? How do you increase the output? How do you increase the safety, if that's applicable? How do you meet deadlines more consistently and regularly? How do you enhance your interpersonal cooperation within and beyond the team? And how do you streamline your systems and processes? Some of those questions are really relevant, and what it means is that if you just ask people, in your team, anyone got any ideas about how we might improve the way we do things, you'll probably just get a whole lot of blank stares. But if you actually say to people, can anyone suggest how we might be able to more effectively meet our deadlines? All right? You're likely then to get people's brains into gear and start thinking about some ways and means of doing that, which is very, very useful. So hopefully that little list will help you just to be able to look. So don't think about systems as some bureaucratic thing, although obviously there's some bureaucracy involved in some systems, and I know many of you are in the public sector and you're dealing with a whole bunch of systems. But systems are also around the way we do things, and it doesn't have to be some documentation. So think about it in a broader scale than just around bureaucracy or writing something or having a policy or something like that in place. So I did talk about diversity earlier, and I did suggest to you that building on differences is really, really important. So what are the differences in your team? And I think the most positive place that you can go there is to start looking at what people's innate talents are. So strength-based psychology has been around for about 25 years, and essentially what it says is this: instead of going straight for the jugular and looking at people's weaknesses, how about we start looking at what people are good at? How about we start magnifying what they do? How about we start harnessing and utilising those strengths for the betterment of the team? It's a much more positive place to start. Now, Don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean you shouldn't pull people up when they're not meeting certain baseline expectations. Of course you should. But if the focus is only on that and it's not on what people do innately, then we're missing a golden opportunity. So start looking at strengths. Now, where do you look? Well, what do people enjoy doing? If I ask you this question, what part of your job do you really, really enjoy? Okay, you think about that for a minute. I will guarantee to you that, hopefully there's something there, by the way. Hopefully I'll guarantee to you that that part of your job is something that you are naturally talented at, because the research demonstrates a high correlation between enjoyment and strengths. So that's a good question to ask. Instead of going up to someone, what are your strengths? When they say, what are you talking about? You know. So what do you enjoy doing? What's the number one thing you enjoy doing in your job? Well, you'll probably agree with them, and you'll probably realise that they're probably doing that fairly well. So, for example, if you've got somebody who's in an accounting role and they're sitting in the back room, but they really enjoy the customer interface, then clearly, if it's possible, it may not be, it may be in the future, but you might start looking at ways of getting that person out of that sort of back room and in front of customers more so, because they happen to be very, very good at that sort of thing. All right, so that's a good place to start with diversity, right? So I think that's a great place to start. Now, there's a whole lot of diagnostics out there that will tell you what they are. I use team management profiles, but there's a bunch of other things out there that you can use. So maybe you might want to invest in some tools around actually identifying what people's strengths are. People find it fun, they find it interesting, it can be very useful for you, and then you can capitalise on those expectations. Or those, for example, what you're seeing on your screen now is team management profiles, which I use, and I know some of you who are in our broadcast today have used this in your organisations. It is a very powerful tool. I'll spend more time on that as we go through the program and giving people an idea to understand what they like to do. So being flexible and adaptable. Now here's a very practical thing that you can do with your team. So yes, I know it sounds like rhetoric, doesn't it? We need to be flexible and we need to be adaptable, but let's have a look at this in a very practical sense. Now, what about if you had a team meeting and you got everyone in your team meeting and you got out a whiteboard and you drew 2 lines down the centre, right? So you got 2 lines down the centre. Now, on the left-hand side, you write down and you make a list of all the decisions that have to follow a process. So you actually said to your team, what are all the things that we have to do in our team that are non-negotiable? They have to be done in a certain way. All right, and you just make a list. You just hear what people have to say, just make a list. So there'll be probably a reasonably long list there. And then what you do is you go to the right-hand side now, and you ask this question, which is the one here in orange. What decisions can we make where we can show complete initiative? Now you'll find that will be probably not quite as long, particularly if you're in the public sector. That's all right. Just keep prompting people, because the reality is we probably have more autonomy than we probably realise. So ask people, what are some examples of situations where we can show complete initiative? So I've got 2 extremes now, haven't I? I've got decisions that have to be followed by the book, and I've got things where I can show complete autonomy. Now, where the interesting one is in the blue. So you fill in the blue now and you say, so what are some of the things that we do day to day, moment by moment, situation by situation, that could either be following a particular system or initiative? And these are the grey areas, of course. And what actually happens in a team is that if there's a culture of following systems, then this blue, all these things in this blue area actually become yellow. So what you have is that you've got people just following the systems to the letter, and then they'll justify their decision on the basis that they're following the system. Now, that's fine if that's what's required, but if initiative is required and you're expecting people to show enterprise, then it's probably not ideal. So you need to talk to people about that. So that's a good little exercise for clarifying and making people feel safe that it's okay to jump in and show initiative in these circumstances. And then, of course, your job then is to back them when they do make those decisions. Right, last one, and we're just about ready to finish. And our last one here is continuous learning. So a team who is high performing is a team that is always learning from itself. Again, it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but the best tool that you can use is what I would refer to as an after-action review. Now, I won't read that quote out, you can read that later, but essentially it's one of the most powerful tools you can possibly use. It's a fancy word for debrief, all right? So you've finished a project, you've completed the piece of work, whatever it might be, you then ask your team, you gather them around, you ask them 3 key questions, and the first question is, what went well? Now, even if it's an absolute disaster, there's obviously some things that went well, right? And you keep asking until you get something. Then you can ask, well, what didn't go well? So what things did not go well in this? Now, this is not an exercise in finger pointing and blame. What didn't go well? Because even if it was done magnificently, there'll be still things that haven't actually gone well. And then the final question you ask is, what would we do differently next time, if there is a next time? And this is the learning, of course. So this after-action review is used extensively in the military, and those of you who have had exposure to the military would probably know more about this than I would. But the reality is, you can't sneeze in a military environment without doing an after-action review. So after-action reviews, or AARs, as it's commonly referred, are great ways of being able to build upon the lessons learned in situations that can be very applicable to you. So, yeah, thanks, Jane. This is quite common in healthcare with health incidents, absolutely, a debrief on a health incident or a safety issue. But I'm suggesting you use it for everything. So any project, any situation, it's a really great thing to do. And you'll find that people will commit to the last question because people don't argue with their own data. So because it's their information, they will probably likely to accept it as reality and go ahead with it. So it works extremely well. It staggers me to think that we don't use it enough. So folks, that's pretty much where we're at now. I've just got a minute now to finish up. So if you've got any other questions, go for your life, because we can respond to those before we sign off. But here's your homework, and I know you're all excited about homework, but look, all I simply want you to do is this. Take one of those characteristics that I've gone through today, there were 8, remember, and I want this, and one of them that really sparked an interest with you. I really enjoyed that characteristic. I got a lot out of it, or I know that characteristic is important. I just haven't done anything about it. And then what I want you to do is to take some action. Okay, I want you to do something between now and the next time we meet, which is exactly a fortnight. So you have 2 weeks to implement one of those characteristics of a high-performing team. I want you to come back and tell me what's going on, what happened, was it a disaster, did it go well, what happened, and look, by all means you can send me a private email as well. It's part of the deal, okay? So whatever works for you, you go ahead and do that. I enjoy the feedback because I know what's going on out there in terms of what you're doing in this broadcast. So folks, that's pretty much it for me. Just a quick recap, there's the 6 modules, or they'll come up on your screen now. I'm pretty much done, and I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful participation today. Some of you really got engaged, and I think if there was a gold star, I'd give it to Jane. Yeah, I think and Chelsea. Chelsea did well. Okay, everyone's saying thank you. Wonderful, great. Okay. Yes, you do get a copy of the slides, Tracy. You'll get them tomorrow, actually. So you'll have them next week if you don't check your emails over the weekend. Thank you. Wow, that's all good. Sounds like I've hit the mark, which is excellent. So, guys, thank you. And I am going to sign off at this stage. And I just want to say thank you and have a great weekend and do your homework. Thank you and goodbye.